Well, g'day and welcome to On Liberty Extra, a one-off extra episode hosted by me, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. And today we have Warren Mundine, Chairman and Managing Director of Nyunggai Black Group, political strategist and author of recent CIS paper, It's the Economy, Stupid. Economic participation is the only way to close the gap. Warren, how are you?
I'm great, just everything's pretty busy at the moment and a busy week, and it's always good to be busy because that means you pay the bills.
And paying bills is quite an important issue we're all being faced with at the moment, but It's certainly something that we want to be able to see more Indigenous people participating in across the nation. So one of the opening points you make with regard to your paper is that conditions must exist in communities that are necessary for private enterprise and commerce to thrive. You also go on to mention that the economic status of Indigenous Australians is not in fact addressed in the current Closing the Gap targets. So can you tell us a little bit about what this means for Indigenous Australians and certainly with regard to closing the gap?
Well, what's been happening in the last, say, 20 years has been this shift in thinking working for community organisations, working through government agencies, and this top-down approach hasn't been working. In fact, over 50 years of this policy area, there's been very little shift in the prosperity of Indigenous people in Australia. And so they said, well, what's the missing element? And of course, the missing element is economic development. There's no race or group of people in the history of humankind that's actually lifted out of poverty, been able to get jobs, been able to have run businesses, to be able to get their kids educated and health services operating in that without having an economy, without having economic growth. It's not rocket science, it's just a fact of life. So that's when they made the shift in 2004 under the Howard government of looking at this area of saying, okay, we need to start focusing on not just service providers, but actually how do we create the environment for investment? And so it's only through that private sector of actually having businesses that are profitable and commercial that create the jobs.
Yeah, certainly, and that's was one of my concerns. I know when there was mention of the fact that that through the Closing the Gap that they would tackle welfare dependency through employment through Aboriginal peak organisations, whereas of course I've argued that would only shift welfare to welfare being part of the bureaucracy as opposed to down to individuals themselves. So important point to be able to support Indigenous enterprise and private businesses, particularly in a lot of the remote areas where it's lacking. So another one of your concerns was around some of the draft targets being set as standalone targets that don't necessarily aim to reach parity with non-Indigenous Australia as standalone targets, even if met, don't indicate how close we are to reaching parity. Can you elaborate further on this point?
Well, the big issue is that there's a couple of things there. When you're looking at governments and you're looking at community organisations, they only employ a certain amount of people. Then it is the private sector that employs the most people, especially in rural and remote areas. Something like 70 to 80%, depending on the region, is employed in small business. That 20 to 30% are actually employed by governments. And that's where you've got this large unemployment pool that's happening out there. When you look at the priority areas, it is all about bureaucracy. And we've been doing that since about 1970. So that's 50 years and it hasn't worked. And we wonder why you get these incredible unemployment levels in that. Prior to the 1970s, most Aboriginals worked. It may surprise some people, but they did work. You know, they worked in the cattle industry, they worked as shearers, they worked as fruit pickers, they worked in a wide range of jobs. And it all changed with the equal pay thing. Now, I'm saying we shouldn't get equal pay, and all of a sudden we were out of work, and the welfare system was able to access the welfare system. So we've had 50 years of unemployment in some of these communities. And the only way to do that is to change it around and start showing opportunities for people. In fact, Canada and other Indigenous groups around the world were looking at us because of the major change we started making it from 2004, because we've set up so many incredible programs that started to make that shift. Now, a good example of that is the mining industry. Now, we've had over 6,000 Aboriginals go into the mining industry, more than 6,000 of that. Just about 1,500 of those are women, and they're in all sectors of the industry, from engineering, truck driving, tradies, office workers, etc. And that's had a major growth factor in economic outcomes for Indigenous people. Then you look at the other areas where now we brought in that policy of the Indigenous procurement policy. That within 5 years has now gone from $6.7 million program to $2 billion. $2 billion, and that cost the government not 1 cent, because they were contracts that were going to go out anyway. So when these Indigenous businesses could meet the merit of those contracts, they got them, and so it didn't cost anything. The problem with this community bureaucracy approach, it costs the taxpayers money, and we've seen that recently with the $50 million that just only went out last week, and we saw that the previous $100 million that went out. These are all taxpayers' money. What is happening in the business sector is that they're not spending taxpayers' money; they're actually becoming taxpayers and contributing to the tax system, which builds the medical service and builds the legal and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that point about the equal pay decision, which sort of goes hand in hand with welfare dependency, which has helped contribute to high levels of incarceration. A lot of Australians seem to think that a lot of Australians have been told, and particularly by the left and by protesters, that Indigenous Australians have been incarcerated at high rates ever since colonisation. But of course, as you mentioned, Indigenous Australians were largely becoming part of the economy. One thing that I came to understand was that incarceration rates dropped dramatically around 1915, and Indigenous Australians became part of the economy, took on jobs and that sort of thing. And then, of course, there's always well-intentioned policy like the equal pay decision, which, of course we want equal pay, but it meant a lot of Indigenous Australians then lost their employment opportunities. And of course, that coupled with welfare has been one of the largest contributors to the high rates of incarceration. But I'll get to incarceration and get you to talk a bit about those targets a little bit after. But firstly, an issue that I've always tried to highlight is the differences between cities and very remote areas, communities. And as you've addressed, you argue separate targets should be adopted. Otherwise, you run the risk of ignoring the gap between remote Indigenous communities and urban communities in identifying successes or failures in school attendance and employment. So how do you propose the government should proceed with these targets going forward?
Well, they do have to take a regional approach, because like you go to some rural communities and the opportunities there are opportunities, but there's low economic opportunities there. And so like in Sydney, the Aboriginal people living in Sydney, they're living in Australia's largest city, they're living in Australia's largest economy. And so therefore it's easier for them to access jobs, access education, access health and other heaps of programs compared to, say, someone who's living in central Arnhem or central Australia, because they don't have those economies of scale that Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane and Perth and that have, and even Darwin. So we have to take its horses for courses. So we have to look at that from a regional approach. And this is one of the problems with the previous targets that we identified, was that when you have this aggregate figure, then it gets put, you don't actually get a full picture, because in Sydney and Perth you may have better outcomes than you have in remote communities. But when you combine those two figures and you aggregate them, then it looks like things are getting better. Mm-hmm. And from that level, and also approach it from what is the economies in those areas. So in Sydney, and that you could be in the building industry, you could be in the legal industry, the medical industry. So in a remote community, the opportunities here are agriculture, mining. So it's a different approach, and we've got to approach it from those different areas. If we don't do that, we don't really hit the right target and the right focus.
Yeah, and that's certainly something that I've come to understand. I think particularly also when it comes to measuring the number of Indigenous Australians who have graduated from university, for example. I think the numbers are wonderful to see coming through, but I mean, I'd personally like to see the measurement of those who have come from remote communities whose perhaps first language is not English, and look at the figures around those numbers that have had the opportunity to even complete high school as well as go on to university. I just want to say to everybody else out there, thanks for joining us today on Liberty Extra. Join the conversation by posting your question in the YouTube chat or Facebook comments section, because after I've finished asking Warren some questions, I'll then throw to the audience to participate as well. So when it comes to education, you've laboured the point about the importance of school attendance, that 90% of attendance is required really for any child to receive an education for job readiness as an adult. Yet the current draft would abolish the existing target to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians for school attendance. Do you think this is setting our kids up to fail?
Oh, look, it's a nonsense approach. If you don't get kids to school, then you don't get kids educated. It's not rocket science to work that out. Even if it's a bad school, it's better than no school. So I just find that mind-boggling that a group of people can sit around in a room and say, oh, school attendance don't matter. They're also dropping the NAPLAN scores and a few other things as well. So how do we measure things? If you can't, one thing we learn in business, and I'm a businessman, is that if you can't measure it, it doesn't happen. Because if we've got 100 kids in a community and 50 kids turn up on Monday for school and 50 kids turn up for Tuesday for school, are they the same kids? There could be 50 other kids from that community. We don't know. Or it could be 25 of them or whatever. So if we don't get those individual figures from each of those regions and regionalise them, we will not know where we need to spend the time, the resources and money. We can say, okay, this is where we've got to spend the money, because people do need to learn English, because they want to. That's the global language now. I go to China, I go to wherever. That's the business and global language. We know that from globally, and looking at Indigenous groups across the world as well as the wider communities across the world, that education is the key, and in the 21st century, it is the key, and we need to have those kids in those schools learning. And learning their language, learning English, learning the sciences and the mathematics and so on. Because they're the key subjects that the kids of the 21st century need. And so we need to do that. And if we are going to, and people talk about self-determination, if you don't have an education and you do not have an economic program in business and jobs, then you're not self-determining at all. All you're doing is living off the government, and the government is still your boss. And this is the problem we have at the moment. everyone talks about, okay, we need to have local Indigenous control and that, but what they're really doing is, through this new policy stream, is setting it up so that the government at the federal level and each of the territory and state governments are getting more control through their bureaucracies, and the people who are running those community organisations dance the tune of the government because that's where their money comes from.
And so the cycle continues.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and data collection was something that I was going to bring up with you, but you've answered those questions. And of course, it's important, and not just in terms of education, but across the board, and which is usually a state and territory responsibility. I guess how can the federal government ensure that the states and territories are upholding their end of the bargain in terms of data collection? Because I know that not only is it important in terms of education for Indigenous children, but I know it's an important issue when it comes to attempting to address the family violence epidemic as well. I mean, I don't know, should it be a federal responsibility? Because sometimes it's difficult to attempt to get states and territories to try to enforce, bring forward the data effectively.
Yeah, well, I don't know how state and territories operate, to be honest, in regard to, because they need that data as well. If they're going to be targeting schools and kids and even adults, and we know globally from research over the last 100 years that if you have parents who are educated, they don't have to be university graduates or science professors, just education. Sufficient education to work. We know that if that gets the parents out there, that gets them jobs. Kids actually then see them being able to read the papers, being able to do their job and go to work. Then they see that as normal, and then they see the link between education and jobs, and education of, I can buy a house, I can buy a car, I can go on holidays, I can do this, I can do that. And I can help my own kids. Then when I get married and have kids, help them do the same thing. And you see it with a number of Aboriginal families, that through that generational thing, to 1 or 2, 3 generations, they've made massive changes to their education, to their wealth. And I'm not talking about being filthy rich or anything, just the thing about being able to buy a home and be able to go on a holiday, even if it's just to buy a car and to put a caravan on the back and go down the beach. That, not necessarily flying off to Europe or Asia or something. That's what that all comes about through that data stuff. So I think because we need to make the states and territories more accountable for this area, because everyone sort of looks, when Indigenous affairs, all look to the federal government.
Yeah.
In actual fact, last time I looked at the constitution of the states and territories and the federal government, Aboriginals living in their constituency are citizens, and we have the same rights as all other citizens. So we have the rights to public schools. We have the rights to go to those Catholic schools, the poor end Catholic schools, which are supported by the government. If you want to, work hard and do things, and you get a bit of extra money and scholarships, you can go to the high end schools. But we have those rights for that, and we have those rights in regard to accessing the health departments, hospitals, and health centres, and that, which the state governments fund, because that's still. That we're citizens. We have that right to do that. But I always found it, over the years, I found it funny that when something had to be done in a community, say, look, I'll give an example, Walgett. This is back in the 1980s. It was floodplain area, so they decided to build the flood wall around the town. And it was quite funny that when it came to the Aboriginal section of the town, the wall bypassed it. And I said, what happened there? And they said, because the federal government wasn't going to fund the wall, and Aboriginal people are under federal government jurisdiction. I said, aren't they under the Walgett Shire Council jurisdiction? Aren't they citizens of Walgett Shire? Aren't they citizens of New South Wales? And they should be getting the same services. So a lot of people were buck passing to the feds, and I think we need to make state and territory governments more accountable, because under the Constitution, they are in charge of health, education, roads, all this infrastructure stuff, land management, and that. So we've got to make sure that they are actually doing the right thing by Aboriginal people and not just buck passing.
Absolutely. And, the one thing that you don't often see in remote communities like other regular Australian communities is, is like the local butcher or the local bakery or, the mechanic and those sorts of small businesses. And that's something that I've mentioned previously in how it can be very difficult in a lot of the remote communities in the Northern Territory for traditional owners who want to go into partnership with private enterprise to set up businesses, and what is often stopping them is the process, which is applying for a Section 19 lease through the large land council bureaucracies to gain access to their own land effectively to be able to establish businesses. So, and one thing that I've that's an issue that I've brought up, and you yourself have mentioned, the need to address this and to review, things like land rights.
Yeah. Well, look, we always, in the wider Australian community, we always talk about regulations as strangling businesses, strangling opportunities to do things. And I always say, how many sets of legislation do you need to save a tree? Because you've got local government, then you've got state government, then you've got federal government, then you have to have ministerial approval and all this type of stuff. I say, look, just simplify, make it a simplified process, and where we can get a yes or no very easy. Now, the problem, and you've raised a very important issue in regard to the land councils, where it takes almost forever to get any approvals. And I look at some people, some of these clan leaders up in Nyungga country and other places, Walpurina, who were trying to get housing ownership, and it just wasn't never going to happen. Even if you were a Harvard law professor, you'd have problems trying to get through the maze of legislation, and let alone just being an ordinary Australian, or a traditional owner from out the back of Yuendamu or something. It just is impossible to get through some of this. And I remember having arguments with them and said, well, in the last 10 years, no one's ever asked us about wanting to get a house. I said, no wonder they haven't asked you, because it would take them forever in the debate. They're not stupid. They sat there and we saw my grandfather and my grandmother and my parents try to do it, and we saw the problems they had. So why should we go through all that crap? And so we got to really get to a position of streamlining those processes so it happens quickly. You get through that process very quickly, and it's a yes and a no. But what we got into now is a bureaucratic nightmare. It's just incredibly crazy stuff. Now, if we're talking about self-determination and traditional ownership being the focus, then why aren't they the final arbiter of what happens in their community? I've been in, like yourself, you come from a traditional community, you come from that area. I've been across Australia into some of these communities. They know what they want. Yes. They know what all they need is a little bit of help about getting there. But the way we've got the whole thing set up, it's just a nightmare for anyone. I don't care how, as I said, I don't care how educated you are. You could be a Harvard law professor. You would actually find it almost impossible to get through that stuff.
Yes, the struggle is real. So I'm just going to go to a couple of questions here now from the audience. So Stephen Henderson, what do you guys think of Aboriginal kids getting an education in the big cities?
Well, I think I don't have a problem at all. In fact, I chair the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation, and what we do is give opportunities for kids to go to some of the GPS schools, for instance, like Joey's and Scott's and the other ones as well. My mind just went blank there for a second. Riverview and so on, and St. Catherine's and that. And these schools really work hard in regard to the education of these kids. In fact, I've seen kids coming out of traditional communities going to these schools and really being successful and moving ahead, because it's about building a climate of normality. It's normal to study. It's normal to go to class. It's normal to have this discipline about how you do your work and how you do your schoolwork and mix and mingle, and it opens up their networks. Three of my boys went to Joey's, and they got mates because you've got kids coming from all around the world going to those schools. They got mates in Philippines. They talk to, and they can go and have holidays with them, and they can do business with them. And they got mates in Hong Kong. They got mates in Southeast Asia and so on, and that, as well as around Australia. And I tell you what, it is so important to give kids the opportunity. Now, some people say, oh, you're taking these kids out of these communities and you're making them white. No, we're not. For every one of those kids has come because they volunteered. I've not anyone. There's no one forced to come. So what it is, the parents and the kids want to come. And for every place that I know that's vacant, you say we'll get 100 people wanting to fill that vacancy.
That's right. That notion that, you'll be white if you get an education is utterly ridiculous, and it's unhelpful and oppressive, I believe. And some of the most successful people that I've seen from remote communities have been those who are, there's a young woman up in Maningrida who I met who's around my age, who said when she was 6, she said her mum, her Yolngu mother, her parents decided they were going to send her down to Adelaide for boarding school. And she went from the age of 6. She said, I was a proper little bush kid. I didn't speak any English. I was forced to learn English at that age. And she's now one of the managers of the local council up there, and she's doing a wonderful job. And that's all a lot of these parents want to see. So it's ridiculous, that notion that somehow you're abandoning your culture or anything like that. If not, you're supporting it even further, and particularly those in the community. So another question here from Steve.
Just before we go on,
yes,
I just find it bizarre that these people who are saying these things are professors at universities. Could not get more white than being a professor at a university.
Can't get any much more privilege.
They're telling us that I got educated, I'm a professor, but we don't want other people to go through this. It's total nonsense. When you look at this is the world. We have Asians doing this, we have Africans doing this, Europeans, South Americans, North Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Aboriginal people. And it's the parents who are pushing this agenda. The parents and their kids want to be here. And so who's to say that they should stop them?
Exactly. I mean, we support migrant families to do exactly that. To get an education so they can excel living here in Australia. So it should be the same expectations for Indigenous Australians. So another question I have here is regarding the voice in Parliament. If it moves forward, won't it effectively be another political power play, and given it will be more than likely be populated by the left? I agree with that. I'll let you answer.
That one off. No, look, I do have a concern. And I just find some of this stuff bizarre at a time that we've had so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation in parliaments, at local government, and areas, and within the power structures within business. People are saying, "Oh, it's racism, and that's holding us back." It's the system that's holding us back. So we need to have a voice to Parliament. And I said to go, I got a voice to Parliament. If I vote for my local member, now whether I voted for them particularly or I voted for another political party, they're still my local member. And I have a right to go in their office and say to them, this is what I have concerns about, and this is what I want you as my local member to do. And this is what democracy is. Democracy is that local member needs to look after his constituents, and Aboriginal people are a large part, especially in rural and remote Australia, a large part of those constituents.
Absolutely, and I'm completely with you on that point, and I think we've got enough representation in terms of the population of Indigenous Australians in comparison to who's sitting in Parliament. I don't necessarily think some of those Indigenous members are representing all of us Indigenous people, but
I don't care black and white or brindle, half of them I wouldn't feed, but that's beside the point. This is democracy. We really, and we need that. And when you look around the world, where you have countries that did have divisions of their nation on race or on religion, you get Catholics and Protestants and Muslims and that, it's always been a disaster. You've got to have, why can't white people, and we've seen it happen, they vote for an Aboriginal person, or an Aboriginal person vote for a white person. Because why? Because they do the job that we want.
Yes, exactly. And I'm quite happy for any kind of individual to represent me.
Chinese background, whatever.
That's right. Okay, I've got a question here from Salvatore Bones, CIS colleague. What, if anything, can governments do to help individuals start business?
First of all, there's a couple of things. Education. Why can't we have in the education system people learning, our people, every person, black, white or brindle, I don't care, because learning about commerce, learning about your own setting up a business, learning about how you can run a business and that. Now, I know a lot of people after that are more happy. Over 90% of people wanted just a job and work their way up in a career path. But we do need those people to become entrepreneurs out there and to run their own businesses. And it doesn't matter whether it's the local hamburger shop or it's a local tradie or whatever. They're the people who create the jobs. They're the ones who create, especially in rural and remote Australia. They're as I said, 70% of employment is through those small businesses and that. So they're the ones we've got, and so people can learn about that. So that's first of all. Needs to be part of the education system. You don't have a negative thing. I'm sick of people saying, oh, just because you're black, you're not going to, or you're Aboriginal or whatever, you're not going to, that you're oppressed, and therefore you're not, no matter what you do in your life, you're always going to be oppressed. Now, I say to those kids, you can do anything. Why don't you look at this? Why don't you look at learning about how do you run a business? How do you do your bookkeeping? How do you do all this other stuff? How do you do your procurement and your supply chains? How do you get out there and market your business? Why? That should be all part of their education, and so that's the start. The other part of that is working with adults. Now, so I think we need to keep it simple. Like, for instance, when you're looking at those working for the dole programs, when they're mowing lawns, why can't one of those people, we can train them, actually run that as a business? I look around a lot of areas, country towns and cities and other places. How many people you see doing lawn mowing businesses and landscaping? It's a business, and they're making money, and they're feeding their families, they're feeding themselves, they're going on holidays, and they're buying homes. That's the other one. Why can't we just start targeting that area and supporting those individuals and making that happen? Yeah. And I'll give you an example why I'm not happy about community organisations running them, because they're not commercial. If you're going to run a business, it has to be commercial, it has to make money, and profit should not be a dirty word, because if you're not making money, then you're not in business and you're not employing people. So we should be promoting that as a good thing and saying, okay, and I'll give you an example. In Dubbo, when I was on the council in Dubbo, there was this garbage wheelie bin business. This bloke was running, which was washing the bins after they were clean, after they'd been empty. And he was getting paid something like $5 a bin. And he was earning $100,000 a year, just washing bins. I was sitting there thinking, gee, I'm in the wrong job. And he's earning $100,000 a year. The local CDP program brought that, which is the community-based program, They put this young bloke in charge of it, and he was really keen about this, and he was doing it, and he actually picked up more people's houses because he's doing such a good job. So him and his wife, they're only young, 20, 21, 22, which I'm my age when I say that's young, and they said, oh, we like to own the business. And the CDP said, no, you can't own it. This was a community-based business. So he said, okay, fine. And he left and he went off and did his own thing, and he did quite well. Him and his wife did quite well. Mm. So what happened to that business? They put this other person in charge of the business, and it was because they had to work for the dole, because they weren't really keen on doing this thing. Within 6 months, the business went bankrupt. Mm. So you've got to have people, and this is what business is about. You've got to have people who are keen, who are hungry, who want to make a success, and that's what we've got to build. Mm.
Yes, absolutely, and take those opportunities. And I think, that's the best way to go. If it's not working for them, if they've suddenly realised,
they should have gave them the business.
Yeah, they should.
And they would have made it successful, and there would have been a really good Aboriginal business working in that town.
Mm. Yeah. Okay, another question by Peter Ballon. A major global demographic trend is the movement of peoples from regions to cities for all the reasons Mr. Mundine has given, e.g. jobs and education. Why should move to the cities not be encouraged?
Look, you don't have to encourage because it's happening. It's been happening since the late 70s, early 80s. The movement of population to the city, and you see that on a global stage. I think last year was the first time that more people lived in cities in the world than lived in rural and areas. So that's a continuation of that. But what we've got to do in Australia is look at other countries. When you look at America, you've got to go through 100 cities before you get to half the population of America. In Australia, you only need 3. So we've got this vast country out here, and we've got great opportunities to do things. What I noticed when I was in Dubbo living, and that's in central New South Wales, it knew it. The government looked at, this is going back to the Whitlam years, they looked at funding Bathurst Orange as a centre and Albury. So they poured a lot of government money into those centres, and they did okay, but they didn't grow that big. Dubbo grew 3 times as quick as them. And why? Because the government didn't give them any money. They actually said, oh, well, we're sitting out here in the middle of nowhere. What can we do to be entrepreneurial and to build our town? And that's exactly what happened. Now, they got an incredible arts centre. They got an incredible performing arts centre. They got industries all over the place in Dubbo and that, while Orange and Bathurst are more, government-funded, government towns and that. So to me, it's about how do we look at that type of model and support more of those regional towns, and so they can be the hubs for their region. So they can have the centre for the hospital, they can have the centre for the for the performing arts, and they could be the local football stadium or whatever. And we need to look at what America did. America, they went. What's the old saying? Go west, young man. They went out there and they developed across the country. In Australia, we're all hanging within 100 kilometres of the coast. That's where most of the population is. You just run a little thing around the country, around the ocean, and there we all are hanging on. People know about the famous map of North Korea, of the Korea Peninsula, where in the south all the lights are on, and in the north there's no lights on. I can show you a map of Australia where you've got a little stretch around the coast where all the lights on, and the rest of the country there's no lights. And
hang on. There's lights right.
One light in Alice Spring and Darwin, but the rest of the places, in darkness. So we need to. How do we build our centres? And it's about encouraging businesses and working with businesses, getting rid of the red tape for things to be happening. And that's, I'm not saying just let it open it up to holders, bowlers, to people do what they like. Reduce the process, even if you're going to have a process that has environmental issues and other things. How do you make it quicker to make a decision? Surely, I think it's about 4 to 5 years. I worked on a gas pipeline once, and it took 16 years to get that pipeline in place, and it only took us 6 months to build it. So so we've got to, how do we make these things happen? A yes and a no quickly, so people can work out whether they're going to invest or not.
Yeah. I think we're going to have to wrap it up fairly soon, but I might leave just two more questions going forward. Tim Stevenson says, even a good policy proposal can be hamstrung by misguided popular opinion or short-term wants. Welfare is less desirable than paid employment, but it seems that governments use welfare to buy votes or silence. So how do we overcome this? I mean, I personally would suggest that education is key to this, because particularly when it comes to Indigenous Australians, I don't think, particularly in remote communities, there's not enough individuals who are educated enough to understand that they can have an informed opinion when it comes to coming to voting, and understand what's going on more so. So what do you say to that question, Warren?
I think that person's a genius. It's very smart, and it's a great question. Look, welfare and economic development are all in one. If people are getting too much, and we're seeing it now in the COVID thing. Like my son and I, we're looking for apprentices. We can't get them because the kids are telling us, "Oh, we earn more money by not working." So why would we come and get up at 6 a.m. in the morning or 5 a.m. in the morning to come and work in a dirty job, and work hard for 12 hours and then go and for less money than what I'm getting on welfare? So we've got, and this is going to be a big issue when COVID-19 finishes. We're going to have this huge, massive problem here because welfare payments have gone through the roof. What we've got, welfare, I've written about this many times, and I know Noel Pearson's spoken about it. I know you have too as well, Jacinta, and Anthony Dillon and all that, how it's become this almost this drug type thing where it just swallows our communities up. And, where you saw communities in the 70s and prior to that, all, like all my uncles and aunties, they all worked. And then when you get into the 80s, the late 70s and 80s, no one works. And you sit there and you go, welfare has just been this poison that's really trapped our thing. Now, I'm not saying we get rid of welfare, because Australians are very generous. The taxpayers are very generous. We always like to help people who's struggling and have hit bad times. But it's about getting them back to work. And this is what we forgot. We said, "Oh, we want to help you to get you back to work." Now we want to help you. You're struggling. And I forgot the work part. We want to get people back to work, and we know from statistics and from studies that if you're out of work for 12 months, it's near impossible to get a person back to work. And so we've really got to have a reform agenda for the welfare system, and we really need, and it's got to go hand in hand with the reform of the regulatory framework of the business sector. Taxation, despite what people think. Some of these mad lefties go out there and say, "Oh, if you reduce taxes, you have less money for the government." In actual fact, what happens, businesses create more wealth, create more employment, and they pay more taxes, and you actually get more money.
Yeah, look, and going back to the point that I was making in terms of education, I know that there are people in remote communities who are told during election time, who have been told, I know certainly when I was running and for other candidates, conservative candidates, that the other side have told people in communities that people like myself want to take away your payments, and they want to take away your royalties, and that scares people. So it is definitely a form of control over Indigenous Australians, and that certainly needs to be overcome, and education is part of that. And I also think culturally too, when you're expected to share everything that you own with your family, this can cause a huge issue, and it's often a deterrent to be employed in a job. Is if you get paid, why would you want to give all your pay to family?
That's a problem. Yeah. And that's a twisting of culture. Our culture was that yes, you supported your families and you supported your extended families and everything like that, and but they forgot about the other part. They supported you. So everyone had to come, I call it coming to the fire camp. When they come to the camp and sat around that fire, you had to bring something to that fire.
Yes.
And if you didn't bring it, they forgot that what the culture did. You got driven out. They said, if you're not going to contribute to the clan, to the community, you've got to go. You know, this is the thing that they forgot. This is what my grandfather and all them, they told us. You come here, you've got to contribute.
That's right.
And we will contribute to you, and that they forgot that. And this is what they do now is just about I take, instead of saying no, I get something from you, you get something from me, and how we work that stuff. And that's the part of the culture we forgot.
Absolutely, and of course, welfare creates that sort of sense of entitlement as well, if you like. Last question now, and this is sort of going to, well, I know when I answer, it's going to answer two sorts of questions. So what books have helped both of you reason about Indigenous socioeconomic problems, and what would be a good book suggestion for anyone who is interested? And the other question was, because this is the book that I was going to mention, which I've mentioned to you before, Warren, was what do you think of Don Weatherburn's analysis in his book, Arresting Incarceration, Pathways Out of Indigenous Imprisonment. So that is a book that I highly recommend having a read of, because it's filled with a lot of historical fact, a lot of the recent data on reasons for high levels of incarceration, the findings of the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody and the realities around that you won't hear from the left. And also some great recommendations in moving forward. And I think probably our Mr. Wyatt should probably have read that as well, with regard to his new targets for decreasing incarceration rates, which we've both discussed on your own webinar, about the fact that there's a failure there to recognise the causes instead of treating the symptoms. But what would you suggest, Warren?
Well, that one is brilliant. Yeah, that's a great book. Don Weaverburn, I just want to praise Don. I've had many briefings from Don, and he had this one. I asked him this question. I said, if I only could do one thing, what would I do? And he said, stop reoffending, because reoffending is 70% of crime, and that means there's 70% of reduction in victims, 70% of reduction in crime in those communities. And if you can do that, and people can go on and become productive for their community. Brilliant guy. He's got to be the best criminologist in Australia, and I love his work. The other one I look at is Why Nations Fail, and it's a history of the world over 2,000 years. Now, don't all panic, because it's an economic book. It's by these three economists out of Harvard University and MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Incredible. And Nobel Prize winners, these guys. And they, in plain English, even I can read it. That's how plain English it is. And it talks about it should be called Why Nations Succeed. And it talks about how you create the environment and the structures for private enterprise and commercial activities to succeed.
Fantastic. So I reckon we can fit in one last question if we keep our answers brief, but I've got one here. I was wondering what both of your political awakening or journey was like after the George Floyd incident. It has really opened my eyes to how radical the left can be. So, I mean, I guess for me, certainly watching my mother. She was the chair of the Indigenous Advisory Committee to the former Labor Henderson government, and she found that her appointment, she felt like she was just a token in that appointment, and that the committee itself was just a token committee for the then Labor government to say, look, we've got our advisors here, but not necessarily take on board the advice that was being provided. So she then decided, was given the opportunity to run for the Country Liberal Party, and was elected in 2012. And having you know, our family dealt with a lot of these huge issues. We supported, when the intervention first came to the territory, we supported this action because we thought finally somebody was listening to what was going on the ground in these remote communities. And while many policies have their downsides, there were some upsides to that policy as well. But and it's been about understanding that belonging to the conservative side of politics means that you do have a voice. You can have a conversation, you can have debate, you can have respectful discussion and discourse, and not expect to be shut down. And you don't have to agree on absolutely every point, but you have the opportunity to be heard. So that's what it was for me. But I'll now hand it over to you, Warren, to describe what your political awakening has been like.
Well, mine was in the mid-'80s. I was may surprise some people. In fact, you've probably seen my book where I have photos of me being a young radical boy, very handsome at the time. I come to the realisation in the Aboriginal movement then, because of the Black Power movement, these people are just about protest. It's about not actually fixing things. It was about being angry and being crazy. And at the same time, I was studying at the South Australian Institute of Technology, SAIT, which is now the University of South Australia. I read about Milton Friedman from the Chicago School, and I looked at some of the stuff they were doing, and then I went out and started reading about how South Korea, after the Korean War, was a basket case, and then within 10 years it was an economic power. How did that do that in 10 years? And I looked at other countries like Japan and so on and like that, and the United States, and this was within the 80s. And in about 1989, I just said, I'm actually a Liberal Democrat. I'm actually a capitalist. This stuff that these people have been going on about is not about actually fixing anything. It's just about being angry and screaming at people. And so I wanted to become a bloke who had outcomes. And I saw running around businesses, and the democratic process, and that I've become a very huge supporter of it. In fact, this friend of mine outed me at this Aboriginal conferences one day. He asked me the question. He said, so what economic area do you support? And I said, well, yeah. And then I knew what he was talking about. And his people said, yeah, so what is it? And I said, well, I'm a capitalist. I said, I'm a capitalist, and I'm a great believer in capitalism, which lifted more people out of poverty and gave opportunities to more people than anything. And you see it all the time. This is what scares me about the direction of the Indigenous policy currently.
Absolutely. I'm a capitalist and I'm proud. In the Scottish accent, of course, because just a little...
Yes, it could have been Scottish.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about that earlier. Well, look, I want to thank you, Warren, for joining us today. It's been a wonderful discussion, and of course, we'll be involved in more chats going forward on your own webinar, and I'd love to have you back here again to have another discussion. And for those of you who have joined us, if you've enjoyed today's show, please make sure that you like this video, subscribe to the Centre for Independent Studies on YouTube, and click the notification bell. Once again...
And I'll go Greg Gutfield here now. Don't forget to read my book, Warren Mundine in Black and White, and Warren Mundine Speaks His Mind, which is unusual, which is about... we look at it from an Indigenous approach, but it's really about talking about how do you make Australia more prosperous and more competitive in a global world. And the policies, doesn't matter whether you're black, white, green, pink or purple, it works for all of us.
And that's what we're all about, making it work for all of us. So thanks again, Warren.
Thank you for having me.